Whether your beer is in a bottle, can, or glass, kick back and relax. It's Better on Draft.
We are live. This is the Michigan Series number 16. My name is Ken. Thank you so much for joining us here at Better on Draft. Of course, you can join us every Friday, 7 p.m. Eastern on twitch.tv/bod podcast, facebook.com/Better on Draft, or just betterondraft.tv. Simple, easy, and straight to the point. We've got a great show for you today. Even though some of our hosts do not have power, we still wanted to make sure we bring you content because that's just what we do. Bringing in my co-host, Wendy. How you doing today?
I am fantastic. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. What are you drinking?
I have got a Transient Ales Old is the New. It's a new age IPA. It is definitely a little bit hazy, but it is very delicious.
Awesome. And subbing in, we have another week we're bringing in a sub in. Former guest, Jonathan Danger Cole. How you doing, and what are you drinking?
Man, I'm doing really well. I don't want to disappoint, but just a little bubbly tonight. A little bubbly.
Hey, being sober is A-OK. We do promote it if you want to. It doesn't matter what you drink as long as you enjoy what you're drinking. But we do have a guest here today. I'm going to have him introduce himself because he's got a lot of titles in front of them. I saw a BA. I saw a Ph.D. So, Mr. Trey Malone, who are you? Where do you work? And what do you do?
Yeah, so my name's Trey Malone. I'm a professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics. So I have what's called a three-way split. So about a third of my job is working in extending research from the university campus to the stakeholders throughout Michigan. And so a lot of what I do is focused on agriculture broadly, but beer and alcohol markets are kind of my passion. So excited to talk about it.
Well, we're excited you're here. Before we get into the nitty gritty of the numbers and business, I know Wendy wants to come in with a question or two to start the load off light.
Yeah, Ken tends to get a little geeked out when it comes to numbers. So I am not very good at numbers. So I thought I would ask a little bit about the backstory. How is it that you came to lead a study about craft beer in Michigan?
Well, so my PhD, actually, my dissertation was on the economics of craft beer. My PhD is in agricultural economics, but what's nice is that I think beer markets really showcase what's going on in food and beverage markets more broadly. So in the 80s, we all know there were, less than 100 breweries in the United States, and then there was the explosion in the number of breweries. Well, at the same time, we were seeing the very similar trend play out in grocery stores. So grocery stores in the 70s had about, on average, 8,000 choices. Today, grocery stores have something like 45,000 different choices on average. So, I think we can, it's easy to kind of zone into beer, but it actually showcases a much bigger story. And so when I moved here to Michigan, I almost immediately got involved with the hop industry. So Michigan is the fourth largest hops producing state in the country. It's really the fourth of three. There are massive players in the Pacific Northwest, but Michigan has been doing, I think, a really interesting job of creating a very unique marketplace. So that was really, I think, the easiest way for me to dip my toes into the water of Michigan beer.
That actually leads me into a follow-up question because one of the articles I was reading, I think it was in Brownfield, you had said Michigan has probably the strongest craft beer scene in the Midwest. I think that the value chain that we have is very unique relative to just about any other state. Can you explain what that means a little bit to those of us who aren't aware of that?
Sure. So I'm drinking Coop F5, which is a beer out of Oklahoma, and that's where my family ranch is and everything. Oklahoma grows wheat, corn, soybeans, beef cows, and that's about all it does. And a lot of the Midwest follows suit and does something very similar. Maybe if you mix in dairy cows, you've got it pretty much figured out. Well, Michigan is actually the second most diverse agricultural state in the country. So we grow more things here than anywhere outside of California. And so what that means is we have the opportunity to create super unique interesting value chains. So last night I was drinking at a cidery not too far from my house in Leslie, Michigan, and we got to talking about King Orchards, who sells the tart cherries for his cherry cider. Well, King Orchards sells about half of the Creek style cherry beers that you have. Odds are that concentrate came from King Orchards up north and outside of Bel Air. That's just one example of many. We're stepping into hop harvest. So actually I'm planning on going to a hop yard in Charlotte probably this weekend to just check it out to see how their Chinook looks right now. But again, you're not going to get that type of diversity or uniqueness in the Iowas or the Illinois or if there are some hop growers in Ohio, but they're calling Michigan State Extension to get answers. We have such a robust program just because of our diversity.
Excellent. Ken?
Yeah, I wanted to bring John because John is in the sales part of the industry. He's been in the industry for a little bit, and I know he's probably got a question for you.
Well, I mean, in my experience in the last couple of years, I'm just really curious what you're seeing on the economic side of how all this is effective craft beer. Obviously, draft was way down because restaurants were closed and still are not up to capacity, but package, exploded. But from your point of view, where are you seeing just craft beer as it is? I know seltzers kind of put a hit on them. I know that the newest trend is the prepackaged Moscow Mules and Jack and Cokes are hitting the market hard. Are you seeing kind of a downward trend of craft beer, or is it just kind of flat still?
Well, I mean, craft beer is a player in a much larger space, right? And in the drinking world of the United States is shrinking. Baby boomers drank more at the same age that we millennials are at. So we drink less, and then Gen Z drinks less than what millennials drink at the same age. And so there is, I think, kind of an interesting question about the long-term trajectory and whether or not COVID really sped up what the trends already were. I think if you talk to the larger players, larger brewers, they'll say that odds are maybe even sold about the same amount of beer in 2020 as they did 2019. It's just that the distribution channels changed, which meant that their revenue changed. Because it's way more expensive to run through the distribution channels that aren't just draft beer sales. And so, that I think is an interesting story to work through. There was obviously PPP was a really big conversation for a lot of the small breweries. I actually have a graduate student who's working on a paper right now on the effect of PPP on preventing brewery closures in the United States. I think it's too early to really say definitively how effective it was. But those brewery closures, they were maybe going to happen in anyways. So there was an explosion in the number of breweries, but that explosion in the number of breweries was stepping into a space that was increasingly competitive. So I'm still excited about especially hyper local value chains with craft beer. I think that beer is such a strong community, but I do wonder about how those communities respond to maybe reopening post-COVID.
It's been interesting. I mean, I just switched to a very, very small brewery about 2 miles from my house to kind of help them test the waters and distribution and see how it's going. But even them at 200 barrels a year, they might do 250 this year. They have gotten themselves a wine license. They've got, they're offering cider, wine, hard seltzer. We're in the process of evaluating whether we can get a spirits license. So just we can offer vodka tonics and other drinks. So it's all about absolutely trying to adapt and keep with what's coming on.
Well, I think people forget is that at the same time that the brewery explosion was happening, really from like 2012 to 2021, we went from like 2,000 breweries to like 8,000 breweries. At that same time, 1 in 6 neighborhood bars were closing across the country. And so I think a lot of those newer, smaller upstart craft breweries weren't trying to be another Founders. They didn't think they were going to be Bell's. They were just trying to make beer for their friends and make some money, in their neighborhood. And so I think it's representative of this kind of change in the perspective of what a brewery is supposed to be. Like I said, I was with a cider maker yesterday. they're talking about brewing beer, and they've got a conversation ongoing about adding more wine. Seltzer's already on the menu. That's at what point are you just a local bar now? I mean, and that's more of an existential question, but it's an interesting one.
I believe looking to expand, a lot of these places, breweries included, we're always looking for more and more products, because as you say, people are drinking less, their decisions are becoming, what I would say is a little bit more specific. They want either liquor or they want beer, and they go to a place that serves beer or that serves liquor. They don't go to a bar anymore, because a bar would carry all of it. But instead of going to the local bar, over by me, I'm in Ypsilanti, so we got McShane's, which is right over on Michigan Ave. Instead of going to McShane's, I'm gonna go to A2 Distillery, or I'm gonna go to Bloom Meadworks, or I'm going to go to Arbor Brewing. So these are the options, because you go to a specific maker. So if I can go to a place that makes all of them, that's great. But I think, and tell me if you agree or not, but the brew pub license, where breweries can bring in all these other products, I think is going to hinder a lot more people who could potentially make all those products and then still distribute. Because that's a hindrance that we're seeing right now, even when we're dealing with, we've got an upcoming festival in October 9th over at Jimmy John's Field, which you can get tickets for right now. Cheap plug, I understand this, but we can't get some of my favorite breweries out there. Like, I can't get Royal Oak Brewing, so I can't be able to share their Kolsch with everyone, or I can't get Detroit Beer Co. So I can't get what Justin Riopel is doing over there. So I think, before I ask my next question, do you agree or not that people are more going towards the craft makers of that specific alcoholic drink as opposed to just going to a bar now?
I think it's probably true. I think it's a whole lot more socially acceptable for somebody to bring their kids to a brewery than to bring their kids to a bar. So there is that other piece of it, right? That the those of us who kind of grew up drinking craft beer, which is a brand new thing, really. Now we've got kids, and that's something that I think is kind of alluring. That's a different conversation than wanting to go knock down beers, at the shop bar in downtown Lansing. And so I think that's the other piece of this that I think matters is you have, I don't want to call it an aging craft beer demographic sample, but you have a demographic that is they're adults now, but they also drink. I mean, I'll go meet up with a buddy, in Howell. We'll meet up because he lives in Detroit, and we just drive over and meet up pretty easy. It feels a whole lot. We were talking about this. He would feel a whole lot worse telling his wife he was going to go meet up with me at the bar than to say he's going to go meet up with me at the brewery after work. And so there's this social acceptableness that I think is probably an important player in this. I love craft beer. But I think that a lot of the people who really love this industry are also very novelty seeking in their preferences. And so, generally I remember hearing the founder of Boulevard talk about how he wanted everybody to think the Boulevard Pale Ale is their go-to beer. But the problem is that's not really how most craft beer drinkers work. We love trying a bunch of different things. We love seeing the rotations. And so it's harder, I think, to try to disentangle what exactly these people want, because what they want changes every time they come into the bar.
I mean, I've always said the craft beer drinker is one of the most disloyal drinkers you may have within the industry. Obviously, places I want to bring this up because I think this brings up a good point about craft beer drinkers. Because John, your former job over at Witch's Hat, how often would someone come and buy your Mug Club membership just for your releases and nothing else? They wouldn't come 364 days of the year.
I mean, Ken, Witch's Hat has over 3,000 yearly members. 3,000. I mean, yeah, a vast majority of those are only coming for the special events.
Go on, Wendy.
I bought a membership at Witch's Hat specifically so I could get the releases because it's too far for me to drive on a regular basis. So I might get there 3 or 4 times a year outside of those releases, but I still wanted to have access to them.
Right. And speaking of, disloyalty, Ken, I mean, it goes beyond that for me. I might go out to, a Hopcat or, a Brown Iron Brew House, and I'll look through the list. And if I have had everything on that list, I might order a glass of water.
Right.
I might not even have a beer. I might have a whiskey on the rocks instead. It's gotten to that point where, yeah, okay, I want something new. I want something new so badly that if I don't have an option for something new, I might not even order an old standby.
So bringing back to, the conversation that I was discussing a little bit ago, because I want to bring Trey back in to the conversation, what do you think is currently the biggest hurdle in governance for Michigan? Like, what is the biggest regulation hurdle that we currently have that's prohibiting business owners from getting liquor, beer, wine, spirits, whatever, to, our glasses at home?
So when I wrote my dissertation, my job market paper, the one that I kind of published first, was on choice overload. So I convinced this wine bar in Oklahoma to double their number of beers to see what would happen to the likelihood somebody would order a beer at the wine bar. And I could actually decrease the chance somebody would order a beer by increasing the number of options that the brewery offered, or that the wine bar offered. The caveat was these were wine drinkers, so they didn't know anything about the product. So we ran it in a sample of actual beer drinkers, and we found that beer drinkers prefer more options, in general, at least. And so that's, I think, something that's once upon a time was a big question. I don't think that question exists now. If I was to say the big barrier or the big hurdle that I've run into time and time again talking to folks, it's usually has to do with zoning ordinances, like local governance issues that we've tried to publish papers on federal law, we publish papers on state law, but when you start getting into these townships, it gets very complicated and very personality driven across the board. And so to me, if I was looking for what is the big barrier to growth in the beer sector in the state of Michigan, I would say it's probably zoning.
How would someone go about trying to address that situation as a whole? Because obviously you have, thousands of cities within the state. I can only imagine. I'm just guessing it's probably, I don't know how many cities there are in the state. But each one has their own zoning issues. Each one has their own regulations. How do you go about creating, I guess, almost like a state law that kind of supersedes it? Because when we talk to a lot of breweries, either the city is on board or they're not. And when the city is on board, that's when shit changes. So like city, they get a meeting, they change rules, they change regulations. We see it a lot. But in the same sense, if you don't have a city that's on board, they're just going to follow the rules that are behind them. So how do you create almost like a playbook for new breweries if I wanted to go open up maybe one in a smaller township, like maybe Luna Pier down in very southeast Michigan?
Well, so we got into this regulations question a while back. We started with this conversation about self-distribution because for a while there, I think self-distribution was probably the most important conversation, that a lot of breweries just couldn't distribute their own beer, so they were forced into these kind of inequitable contracts with wholesalers across the country. I think that we've seen a lot of progress on that. But the next step was just to think like, okay, how many regulations does it take to get a beer? So we used machine learning to go through the Code of Federal Regulations to count every single regulatory restriction from the hop yard to the 6-pack that it takes to get a beer. And what we found was, if you add them all up, directly and indirectly affecting the beer value chain, federal law includes about 110,000 regulations. And so, what I like to say there is that, even if everybody's 99.9% compliant, at the end of the day, odds are you probably never drank a perfectly legal beer. Odds are somebody broke a rule somewhere. And so then the next piece of the paper was to dig into the state level laws. And so we published a paper a couple months ago on state level regulatory restrictions was a big emphasis. And what we found is that Michigan's about middle of the pack. In total, we found something like 6,000 federal regulatory or state level Michigan regulatory restrictions from the production to retail side of the business. But again, that's enough regulations that a lot of this is going to be personality driven in terms of enforcement. So what you're talking about with these like city level, like if the city's on board, well, yeah, that's what the law says, but we'll if we have to, we'll change the law or we'll find ways to be helpful for you. But for every one of those conversations, I bet you probably have 3 or 4 of the exact opposite of that conversation. I don't know how you rein in that type of zoning at the state level. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I would love to hear one.
So in our chat, which again, you can listen live better on draft.tv, Bill corrected me. 276 cities, 257 villages, and 1,240 townships. Fun fact for the day for all of you geography nerds in Michigan. Another question from the chat, though, and this kind of ties back to a little bit earlier, but Matt Bush, former host of the show, asked, do we think less than stellar brewers are no longer going to get away with bad beer? So we're not calling out anyone specific, but we had one in Michigan that showed up and did not have good beer and actually got their doors shut pretty quick, and that was Shipwreck over in St. Clair Shores. They couldn't. They opened up to really bad press. So do you think that with the inundation of all these options, as well as people drinking less and using their money more wisely, that brewers with bad beer will kind of close up shop, or do you think they'll still exist here in years to come?
I've been wanting to put this question on a survey for a while. What percentage of breweries makes bad beer? I'm just curious, what the community of beer drinkers think the answer is to that question. I'm going to give you my
personal answer, and I'd say about maybe 10%. 10% of breweries that I walk into, I cannot find a beer that I want to drink. And mind you, my palate, I will drink sours. I will drink anything that's malt. The only thing that I really don't like is IPAs. But if you can't provide me anything that's not an IPA, that's considered, to me, that's a bad brewery. 100%. If you can't give me even the option of a lager, a Kolsch, a Pils, something clean, a brown, an amber, a blonde, something spicy like a wit, or like a winter ale, depending on the time. If you can't give me that kind of beer, that's a bad beer brewery, in my opinion. I don't know if Wendy, you've been to, I think, 8,000 breweries, give or take.
A few less than that. I think it might be a little bit higher, in my opinion, but it's such a personal answer, though, because you can go into a brewery and be like, their beer is horrible. Why are people drinking this? And then you talk to the people at the bar, and they're like, this is the best stuff ever. I only come here. So it's so personal that I think that's really hard to actually answer that question. And I also believe that there's a lot more to keeping a brewery in business than making good beer. There's so many things that impact whether people will show up and whether they're going to spend money with you. And I don't necessarily think that we're disloyal as craft beer drinkers, because I'm very loyal to my favorite breweries. I'm willing to spend money other places, but I'm always going to go back to those ones when it comes down to it.
I think you're right. I think, for me, I've got a couple breweries. Like I've got my Cheers bar, in Mason. I go to Bad Brewery, and I love walking, but I don't know that I've ever drank the same beer twice in a row. I rotate super hard when I get to that bar. And so I think the disloyalty is more on the style or the beer choice than it is the brewery. But I think there are a lot of breweries that don't make particularly great beer. But I think that we're not really just selling beer. And I think that's the thing that maybe makes all of this make more sense when you go talk to somebody at a brewery that you're like, man, their beer is terrible, but they have a lot of loyalists, and they have the people that are loyal to that bar, and they love rotating through what I would consider to be bad beer, but what they love because of the friends that they have at that bar. And that matters a lot in this conversation, I think.
Yeah, it's really community. I mean, I was just I was out selling beer to a bar yesterday, and an old bar owner who had sold his place last year happened to be there, and we were chatting, and it's really community. And I don't see any reason why I don't know that there's a real bubble for a local brew pub, because I live in Howell, by the way. You said you meet your friend in Howell, and I work for Aberrant Ales, which is the brewery downtown Howell. So next time you meet your friend here, please call me. I'll meet you down there for a beer.
Yeah, cool.
But anyways, what we were saying is, every town, I mean, Howell downtown, there's 4 coffee places in a 2-block period. If there's 4 places you can get a cup of coffee, that's a specific coffee place, not let alone all the other places you can get a cup of coffee. You can have a brew pub in every small town, and it doesn't have to be good beer. It's community. People just identify with it. It becomes their night out. They want to see the regulars. They want to see the owner, the bartenders. They know the schedule of the beers coming out. I mean, they revolve a huge amount of their social life when they become attached to a brew pub.
I think you hit it right on the head, and we've talked about this ad nauseum on this show, is that while we think the launch of breweries is going to slow down, it's the community brewery that is going to help a community that's going to be in those small cities, those very, very specific areas that don't have a brewery, that don't have a craft beer bar, that can easily progress with a brewery to where people will come, one, to just check it out. And if they like it, if the beer is good, if it's not too overpriced, they'll still go. Before I pass it to Wendy for her next question, John, I want to give you the opportunity to answer the question of percentage. You can pass if you want. You're in the industry.
Sure.
You just tagged where you work. I didn't say anything earlier. But do you want to answer in a percentage? Again, not calling anyone out.
For sure. I mean, bad beer, it is very subjective. I've been places where the beer is uninteresting, that is uninspired, that is boring. But was it bad? No, it's not bad beer. It's just not great, Actual bad beer for me is places that are serving either green beer that they're rushing because they're not making, taking the time to get it out, infections that are rampant and that they refuse to hear about, or just dirty draft lines. Holy cow, yes. Dirty draft lines.
That's the one. If I can taste the draft line, it's bad beer. That's a bad brewery to me.
Yeah. So I honestly, I'm with you, Ken. I think it's 10% or less that make truly bad beer. I think it's probably like 50% that make uninteresting beer. That's, I'm not trying to be mean. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not good beer. It could be very good beer. It's just kind of like, but that's okay, because we need community brew pubs. We need places just to go sit and have a beer. I mean, 80% of the beer drinking public still drinks Bud Light and Miller Lite, the most uninteresting beer in the world. So just because it's uninteresting doesn't mean it's a good, not a good quality beer.
There's a reason why my home bar back at back when I grew up in Troy, the Gathering Place, is still up and still moving. And it ain't because they're throwing out craft beers. It's because that's the community that was built around that bar, and that's still there. They're still drinking. While we were discussing the one brewery, and I want you guys to, this might be before your time coming up here, Trey, but the brewery that keeps coming up into my mind during this discussion is Hideout Brewing in Grand Rapids. As you either loved it, you hated it. Either it was all bad or all good. But the one thing that was always reminded me of Hideout was, especially seeing breweries that are losing power the past few days, is I went there, they lost power, and they sold me a flight and a pint for $10 because that's how much cash I had on my hand. And but that's an experience that I will always remember, to the point where I will always go back to that place. And that might have been a bartender specific giving me that experience. But Hideout just had such a huge, I would say even bigger than Atwater, a huge, either one side or the other. There is no middle. There is no, I kind of liked it. Wendy, I keep postponing it. I know you got a question, so I'm bringing it to you.
So my question, Trey, is what is the end result that you're personally hoping for from all these studies?
Well, so my passion is small and medium-sized farms, actually. So I'm very interested in this kind of change in the agricultural and food economy where we're seeing the decline of medium-sized producers in the ag value chain. I think breweries play an interesting role in this, because again, they showcase what's going on in the rest of these other groups. I've worked pretty closely since I got here with the hop industry. And so we actually have a paper that I'm probably the most excited about right now in review on terroir effects in beer. So Michigan, like I said, it's very geographically separate from the other hop growing regions in the United States. And so we've been running a bunch of sensory tests with folks at Bell's and Founders, and we were going to run some experiments in Traverse City, but unfortunately COVID, so we couldn't run our experiments. We had five kegs that were ready to go, where we'd done some kind of interesting hop variation to see if people could taste the differences in flavor profiles. But that part is really exciting to me, because it again, Michigan has this opportunity to create something that's like super unique that nobody else could have. And maybe seeing that growth in some type of, state identity, state community aspect, in a world where everything just feels so polarized and angry, like the idea that you could rally around this local product that you can't get anywhere else in the world it's something that like really makes me super giddy when I get to talking about beer.
So talking about hops, it's actually kind of funny because I've learned to like IPAs basically by learning about hops. I couldn't stand them. I couldn't understand why there were some beers that were like, oh, I can drink that, and then others I didn't. And I went on a beercation and I started asking about what types of hops they put in the brews. So I started learning a little bit more and started understanding a little bit what it is that I do and don't like. So what is it? Is there a hop that you prefer out of Michigan?
Chinook is the runaway unique thing that we do here. So we even have what's called the Chinook Cup, where all the growers compete every year. And Alec Mole and some of the other kind of big shots over in the western part of the state, they'll co-judge this Chinook Cup. But Chinook is the one that I think Michigan's kind of gotten it's become a little bit famous for in certain breweries. But one thing that's really hard, I think, is that back to this zoning conversation or regulations conversation, you have a lot of small growers who are pounding pavement to go talk to brewers. They're farmers, they're not salesmen. So like there's an issue there. But then the other issue is they go try to talk to these folks, and yeah, the brewer got into this because they love beer. But at the end of the day, most of their day-to-day work is not the beer part. It's the restaurant part. It's the regulations part. It's paying taxes or whatever it is. It's the neighbor that's complaining because people are parking in the parking lot, when they're not supposed to. And so, these growers are trying to create these like positive relationships, but the brewer is just bogged down with the stuff that isn't really what I think we would hope that they were doing with their time.
Absolutely. John, did you have anything?
No, I think, we hit kind of all the stuff I was really interested to hear about.
Well, I guess I can cut in because I've always got plenty of questions to ask.
Hit us, Ken.
So I was reading your opinion piece on USA Today, and obviously we are 14 months or so to the day of when you wrote that. Being in the industry, I worked in restaurant point of sale. I saw the stark concern of what was going on within the restaurant industry and the brewery industry. You touched on it earlier, and you had mentioned someone is trying to look at the effects of PPP within the restaurant industry itself. But as the Brewers Association noted, and I believe you agreed with, that we were going to lose half our breweries at the end of the pandemic. I believe the PPP obviously affected positively that number to not be, over 50%. But with you being in tune within the industry, the economics and the governance, where do you think, if you could adjust that number today, what percentage do you think we may lose by, the end of 2022? Oh,
it won't be anywhere near that. That was well, that was in April of 2020. That was the same time I was getting, I'm not exaggerating, I was probably talking to 3 reporters a day about just the food industry in general. About that was when everybody thought we were going to run out of meat. So like I spent a lot of time trying to explain to people how meat supply chains work. And like the world was falling apart around us. Most of these small breweries are basically just, in-house distribution centers. Like there are no other alternatives for how they can make any type of revenue. So that PPP paper is an ongoing project with my graduate student, Aaron Staples, Bart Watson, who you mentioned already. And then he's actually interning with USDA. So it's the 3 of them that are working on it for the summer. But I think it's pretty promising, but it was not anywhere near. I don't even think it was near like 20% of breweries closed. Like I think we're doing okay.
I believe we're still. I don't think we're going to see the full outlook until the end of next year, just because.
Of course,
I think the PPP kept doors not necessarily open, but the possibility of the doors open. We still have, if you guys haven't already downloaded the Michigan Brewery Map app, it's a free app for you to use on iOS and Android. Does have a designation for COVID closed breweries, and I believe right now we're at still 6. And of course, there are a handful that were closed during COVID that did not reopen, like Big Cat up in Charlevoix, Lake Charlevoix, maybe one of those cities up there, in the Traverse City, Petoskey, in that top of Michigan, Lower Peninsula area. Obviously stay tuned, download that Michigan Brewery Map app so you can see which breweries are opening or closing, because we did have openings too. I know the big one, and I don't know if you had a chance, there was one in Battle Creek that opened that had to open during COVID because they brewed beer, COVID hit, and they're like, well, we have all this beer that needs to get sold. So they were just doing growlers and crowlers to go. And I think that showed kind of what we expected within the craft beer industry is that, 1, people helping other people, but 2, surviving any way you can. Now, in New York and New Jersey, we allowed breweries to self-distro directly to consumers temporarily. That was a temporary thing. Well, the result of that, will we see that become permanent in those states, do you think? And do you think that's something Michigan could hop on anytime soon?
The thing that I'm like, our pandemic changes on beer regulations that I'm probably the most excited about are the outdoor drinking areas in a lot of these towns. I think that kind of opens the door for a lot of exciting opportunities, collaborations. I think we're stepping into, we already mentioned the community aspect, but it's not just about beer. And so, being able to bring in some of these collaborations between small businesses in these downtown regions of communities is a super exciting possibility that I think has a lot of legs in terms of sticking around.
I want to cut in real quick because, 1, I want to plug episode 219.5, Better on Draft, which we had Michigan State Representative Michael Weber, which is the guy who wrote the bill that you're talking about for the social districts out of Rochester Hills. That's about a 30-minute episode. It was a fun half episode. Matt Bush joined us, as well as our editor-in-chief, Ed. So go check that out to get the nitty-gritty details of that. But continue.
Yeah, I think so. One of the first papers I ever published was on self-distribution and how the places that have the ability to self-distribute saw a pretty significant increase in the number of breweries in that area. So self-distribution is obviously going to be a big part of any of these stories. But in the state of Michigan, I think we're kind of middle of the pack in terms of regulatory burdens. If we were in the southern United States, we might be having different conversations. But I was at a Bad Brewery the other day, and there's this awesome floriculture business that's going around, and they harvest their flowers in the mornings, and then they sell at the brewery in the afternoons. So they drive around from like brewery to brewery selling out of this cold storage truck. And I think the more of these collaborations that are allowed, the better off the industry is going to be. So that's really super exciting for me in terms of COVID changes for Michigan.
is there I'm gonna give you before we close up, because we're about 40 minutes in. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about the industry as a whole, especially from someone who's intelligent enough to talk about it, and not me just getting on my soapbox and pretending I know what I'm talking about. I want to say I get about 85% right, which is a B, and B's get degrees, and maybe I could become a doctor soon of craft beer like you. But is there a law that you wish you could change right now? Like you've got the Michigan Senate and the Michigan House. They've got you a podium, and you say, I want this to change because I think it would boost the Michigan beer economy like that.
So I don't have a good answer. I know that the answer, if you go talk to the ag guys that I hang out with, they'll talk about the farm brewery legislation in New York State as being something they would like to see. I'm far more skeptical of that farm brewery legislation.
You're gonna have.
I don't know if y'all have ever heard of it.
You're gonna have to give us a TLDR.
Okay, so basically, you are exempt if you register as a farm brewery. You're exempt from certain state level regulations. But the catch is you have to agree to source X% of your inputs from within the state. And so it's a ratcheting level of input. So I think it started at 20%. But over time, it goes to something like 80% of your inputs have to come from the state of New York. On the ag side of things, there's a lot of interest and excitement about that possibility. From who makes bad beer side of things, I think anytime you restrict what inputs a brewer can use, you are playing with fire in terms of not being able to get great beer. I'm not saying that the malt barley that they're producing in New York State isn't good. I'm not saying the hops aren't good, because they are. But when you have a state that's still in its kind of infancy stage of developing these industries, all it takes is one rough year for these guys, and the next thing you know, it's a lot of really rough beer in the farm brewery scene. So I don't have a law that I can tell you. I honestly, the conversations I generally end up having usually end up circulating to the zoning ordinance stuff that sometimes people can fight into right to farm conversations about it. Michigan has one of the strongest right to farm legislation in the United States. So there's a lot of hope for that, especially the kind of out in the country breweries. Breweries tend to be people magnets, is what Neil Reed usually says. And, the more that, especially in a world where, I don't know if y'all saw the 2020 census data that just came out today. So they just released the 2020 census data, and there were a whole lot of counties in the state of Michigan that have lost population. And so adding in a brewery might be a really nice way to try to induce some more population growth into those kind of struggling communities. And if there was a way to incentivize more of that conversation, I think it would be a wonderful move. A person that would be really good for you to talk to, by the way, is Janelle Jagman, who is the executive director for the Michigan Craft Beverage Council. This is like a brand new thing, I think 3 years old now, that the state of Michigan is really started working with to try to support the not just once upon a time was just wine. But 3 years ago, they made the move to include cider and beer in their alcohol craft beverage space. So I think Michigan's doing its best to try to move in a way that can support this industry.
All right, well, that's going to do it, the Michigan series. We have one final question for you. We like to all just kind of ask a fun final question to end the show. So I'm going to start with Wendy so that John kind of preps himself a little bit mentally since he's a guest host here. But Wendy, what's your final question for Dr. Trey Malone?
So my final question is, in all of these studies that you've been doing about craft beer in Michigan, what is the most interesting piece of information you have come across?
Well, so the most interesting thing that I've read was the Frances Stroh biography or autobiography. I don't know if you've read her memoir, but Frances Stroh talking about growing up in that family kind of at the end of the term of that brewery is fascinating writing. But the most interesting kind of objective fact that I've learned is the uniqueness of the terroir in Michigan hops. In my mind, I always kind of assumed that terroir was kind of made up. But you can actually taste it and you can see it, like in the way that the data comes out when you run the analytics. And that to me is just wild, because in a world where I'm from, that's like wheat, corn, soybeans, beef cows, you can't tell a difference in wheat that was grown in Iowa versus wheat that was grown in Oklahoma. But by God, you sure can in hops, which I think is just super fascinating.
All right, John, what's your final question?
I've kind of been of the mind lately that that the ability to become that like 50,000 barrel tier brewery is kind of over.
Yeah,
I really feel like, the Bells and Founders was kind of the last group, maybe Shorts throws in there out of the Michigan groups, right? They're going to reach those levels. That really it's nationwide larger growth for those guys. And it's the small community pubs that self-distro in a very tight local circle. Do you get that sense on a bigger overview of the economical state of the industry?
Well, I mean, like I said, I think from that 2012, 2,000 breweries to now 8,000 breweries or whatever, that was a whole lot of small guys that just wanted to be small guys. And that's okay. Probably one of the examples of a brewery that I think leveraged in this area to a larger size, obviously not that large, but Old Nation, ended up kind of jumping onto the scene pretty big. But that was, style driven. And so that's kind of a harder question. Where I'm from, if you've ever heard of Prairie Artisan Ales, that Prairie Bomb really just took off. And that's another, great brewery. But for every one of those examples, you have plenty of alternative examples where people tried to expand their distribution too quickly. Another one of my favorite breweries, the largest brewery in Kansas, Tallgrass Brewery, they make a really good beer called Buffalo Sweat. They expanded their footprint too quick, I think, and they paid the price. Now they're just, I think, self-distribution, like a real small footprint in Manhattan, Kansas, where I was drinking Buffalo Sweat in Arlington, Virginia, at one point. So I think it's not impossible to imagine a world where something goes viral in the same way that some of those kind of earlier breweries did, but I also would not expect there to be that many of that type of growth pattern, especially in a world of mergers and acquisitions now, right? So like if you get cool enough, if you're Elysian or you're Wicked Weed, and you're not that big, but somebody notices you at Anheuser-Busch, AB InBev might get super interested quickly, and the next thing you know, you're on a whole lot of shelves. But what do we call that now? It's not really the same thing as Founders or Bells.
So I want to, before I ask my final question, give you guys some numbers because I'm a number nerd. These numbers are available on the the betterondraft.com website. For 50K, there hasn't been a 50K brewery that I can see from my eyes that was in Michigan other than Bells and Founders since Atwater 2016. Currently, which Atwater is currently owned by 10th and Blake, and right now they're only doing 16,000 barrels as opposed to the 50,000 of 2016. Shorts and New Holland are both over 40K but less than 50K, and they have been for the past 5 years straight. That includes 2020. All those numbers are available again on the betterondraft.com website for you to go. And your Prairie, as it wasn't as big as Prairie, but your Prairie reminds me of Liberty Street. But I think Liberty Street out here in Michigan had the issue of going into distribution and then the giant wave of breweries that came in fighting for SKUs on the shelves. They just could not assert themselves on the shelves like some other breweries. So they actually removed themselves from distro, and in turn, they were not allowed to distro anymore. Because that's how they got out of their deal with whatever distribution channel that they were in, Powers, Rave, Fabiano, whoever. I don't know who, I just named the three biggest ones. So my final question to you is because I do a lot of research on our guests, and I stalk them and I check them out to see what they like and what they don't like. My question for you is very simple. Rank these three albums in order: Dookie, Insomniac, or Nimrod? Nimrod,
Nimrod, Dookie, Insomniac.
All right.
That show was awesome, by the way. That was a fun night in Detroit.
I've seen them a handful of times, but my favorite show was still 2001 with The Living End. Easily one of my favorite concerts I've ever been to. That's going to do it. The Michigan Series number 16. Dr. Trey Malone, can they find your work anywhere? Do you have social media that you want to throw out there for them to follow?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm so at Dr. Trey Malone, but I also have I publish a lot of papers, so I'm all over the place.
All right. Again, Michigan Series number 16. If you're listening live, stay tuned for the news segment in about 10 minutes. And if you're not, stay tuned for the news segment on Monday. No matter what you think of your beer, we think it's better on draft. Have a good night. Wendy.